Turn on my mic. Yeah, hearing will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome back for the second time today to discuss the President's budget proposal for FY 2024. Early this morning, Secretary Holland and with the Interior Department joined us, and now we are pleased to welcome the Administrator Regan from the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you for being here today, Administrator Regan. As you know, I previously served as chairman of this subcommittee, and I'm very excited to be back in this role again, in part because I am a lifelong conservationist from a western state and recognize the importance of protecting and preserving our land and water resources. But as I said the last time I was chairman, and we'll say it again, the overspending has gone on for too long, and we need to tighten our belts. When I chaired this subcommittee a decade ago, we wrote and passed a bill in the House that reduced EPA funding by 18%. I thought it was only 17, but it was 18%. We again need to have a serious and reasoned discussion about our federal spending. The President's FY 2024 budget proposal for EPA totals $12 billion, a 19.2% increase above the current level. If enacted, this would be the highest level of funding for EPA in history. And the record high budget request comes alongside the unprecedented influx of more than $100 billion EPA received from several large spending packages this year. Already, the agency has hired an additional 742 staff using money just from the infrastructure bill. One of my concerns is what all of this hiring is going to do to the agency down the road, because the money from the packages last year is temporary, not permanent. Is the agency going to be pitting Congress with a hiring cliff down the road? Additionally, while the increase in EPA budget request is staggering, it's concerning that the budget proposal to flat fund many bipartisan and popular programs and grants that go directly to states, tribes, and local governments. In fact, the proposal eliminates or reduces funding in some of the most popular places like rural water technical assistance funding, while substantially increasing select program enforcement and environmental justice by $312 million, clean air by $459 million. That will be dead on arrival in this House. Finally, I'm concerned that the EPA barrage of burdensome regulations that are harming everyone from farmers, energy developers, critical mineral development, and American families who will bear the brunt of the cost. Just a few weeks ago, the House passed with bipartisan support a Congressional Review Act disapproval resolution on the administration's Waters of the U.S. rule, which went into effect 8 days ago on March 20th for all states except Texas and Idaho due to a court decision. From where I sit, it seems like the rulemaking staff at the EPA is continuing to sprint to get as many regulations as possible on the books, which will have serious consequences on our economy, jobs, energy security, and reliability. Rolling back the WOTUS rule received bipartisan support in Congress, and I hope that it is a clear message from the to the administration that Americans are concerned about overregulation. I know many of my colleagues have questions for you today, and I am ready to have the necessary and tough deliberations about how best to spend our limited federal resources in order to ensure our natural resources, our waters and lands in Idaho and across the country are protected and preserved while still promoting economic development and job creation. Thank you, Administrator Regan, for being here today, as I said, to have this discussion with us. Now I'd like to yield to Ranking Member Pingree for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back to the subcommittee, Mr. Regan. And Mr. Amin, thank you for being here. The EPA's budget request totals $12.1 billion, an increase of $1.9 billion over the enacted level to support its mission to protect human health and the environment. The request proposes substantial increases to address the climate crisis through robust funding for the EPA's science and technology and environmental programs. It makes important investments in environmental justice programs so that we can continue to address historic underinvestment in underserved and overburdened community. The budget request also makes key investments in EPA's workforce. Not only has the EPA mission expanded tremendously over the last decade, but the growing challenges around climate change requires more expertise and more staff. To recognize these growing demands since fiscal year 2021, this committee has worked in a bipartisan manner to increase the EPA's budget by nearly $900 million. These investments have paid off, and we increased funding in all areas that both Democrats and Republicans care deeply about. Historic funding levels for environmental justice, for example, reaches all states and many rural areas in both conservative and progressive districts. Historic funding levels for clean air and clean water programs make sure we all breathe clean air and have access to clean water, no matter where you live and who you vote for. We cannot and should not reverse progress we have made to protect human health and the environment. The EPA should be fully resourced and staffed. Recent rhetoric about cutting federal spending to its fiscal year 2022 levels would have a damaging impact on the EPA. It would amount essentially to an $800 million cut when you include fixed costs. This is unacceptable. Mr. Regan, I look forward to hearing more about what this cut would mean to the EPA. I'm also interested in hearing more about the new federal standard which would regulate PFAS in drinking water, which will bolster public health across the nation. This is a significant step to deal with these harmful forever chemicals, and I look forward to hearing more about the progress you've made on this and PFAS in air and soil. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us today. We appreciate your testimony and your answers. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Pingree. We're fortunate to have the ranking member of the full committee with us today, and I'd like to yield to Mr. Laurel for any opening remarks.
I think in all the time I've spent in the House of Representatives is the very first time I've been in this room. It was, I swear to God. I said, where is 2008? You know, whoa. Anyway, listen, it's great. It's wonderful. Okay, thank you.
2008 is a distant era.
We're in close quarters here.
Yes, well, but, you know, it's homey. This is great. Thank you. A real thank you to you, Chairman Simpson, and to Ranking Member Pingree, and for holding what is an important hearing. And Administrator Regan, it's really wonderful to see you, as well as you, Mr. Amin, you know, in your work at the agency. You know, the EPA plays a very critical role in all of our lives. We witnessed this recently on a national scale as critical cleanup work surrounding the disaster in East Palestine and the spill in the Delaware River continues right now. The EPA is central to cleaning up the contaminated water and lands that people rely on. Right now, parents in cities around these areas, even many miles away, do not know if they can turn on their tap out of fear. What are their kids going to drink? They are scared to breathe the air outside their homes, but the EPA has a key role in understanding the size and the scale of these disasters, oversees the cleanup, making sure those responsible do not cut corners. For this reason, I'm proud that in the 2023 bill we passed in December, we strengthened the EPA's ability to serve American families. We included critical funding to restore and preserve our lands and bodies of water, including critical funding for the Long Island Sound. We dramatically expanded environmental justice efforts to address unacceptable pollution in underserved communities. We provided funds to clean up contaminated sites, hold polluters accountable, and we strengthened water management projects, including investments in lead pipe replacement and water and sewer infrastructure. The President's 2024 budget requests builds on these critical investments by strengthening environmental enforcement efforts and recommitting to clean water, land, and air programs so that these are safe, healthy today and for future generations. I'm also glad to see a significant increase for environmental justice work. People of color and historically underserved communities are hardest hit when disasters of all kinds strike. We saw this as recently as this weekend as tornadoes swept through vulnerable communities across Mississippi and Alabama. We have so much work to do. However, there are some of my Republican colleagues who are calling out to cut the 2024 budget to the 2022 level and even more. This in fact these are extreme in my view, because what it does is to, and we also have some former Republican officials who would fully eliminate critical programs that threaten so much of the progress we've made to ensure the health and the safety of our communities. As you have mentioned in your letter to me, Mr. Secretary, on the impacts of these cuts, they could set our success back years, threatening the sustainability of water systems that thousands of people rely on, undermining critical improvements to clean water and wastewater infrastructure, regulators who ensure water is safe to drink and who keep things like lead and asbestos out of our water would be eliminated, especially impacting tribal lands. Progress being made towards addressing forever chemicals such as PFAS would be reduced. Programs that address wildfires would be delayed, putting lives at risk and letting our firefighters down. These cuts would jeopardize work to ensure compliance with environmental laws, an area that has brought in billions of dollars, catching those companies who are cheating emissions testing. The health of our environment and our communities cannot fall victim to denial and to political stunts any longer. Mr. Administrator, I know you agree. I look forward to our discussion. And with that, many thanks to you, Mr. Chairman, and to you, Ranking Member Pingree. Yield back.
With that, Administrator Regan, you may proceed with your opening statement. Your officially submitted testimony will be included in the record.
Thank you, Chairman Simpson and Ranking Member Pingree and Ranking Member DeLauro and members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the necessary vision laid out in the United States Environmental Protection Agency's proposed fiscal year 2024 budget request. In this budget request, we lay out an ambitious plan for our EPA with the goal of building a healthier, more prosperous nation while ensuring global competitiveness and energy independence and security. President Biden's proposed FY 2024 budget request for EPA provides $12.1 billion to advance key priorities, including protecting air quality, upgrading our nation's aging water infrastructure, tackling the climate crisis, and rebuilding core functions at the agency. Over the last year, we've made significant progress towards many of these goals together. I'm proud of the foundation we've laid and the partnerships that we have underpinned our success. But there is still much more work to do to ensure that all of our children have safe, healthy places to live, learn, and play, to build a stronger, more sustainable economy, and to advance American innovation and ingenuity. Simply put, investing in EPA is investing in America. Across the country, poor air quality still affects millions of people, perpetuating harmful health and economic impacts. In FY 2024, the agency will protect our air quality by cutting emissions of ozone-forming pollutants, particulate matter, and air toxics. The President's budget includes $1.4 billion to improve air quality and set standards that reduce pollution from mobile and stationary sources. EPA's work to set these standards provides certainty to industry, build on advances in technology, and reinforces market movement towards a cleaner energy system that provides safe, reliable, and affordable energy. A thriving economy also requires clean and safe water for everyone. Although progress has been made, many still lack access to healthy water, face inadequate wastewater infrastructure, and suffer from the effects of lead pipes. America's water systems are also facing new challenges, including cybersecurity threats, climate change, and emerging contaminants such as PFAS. The budget proposes more than $4 billion to upgrade drinking water and wastewater infrastructure nationwide with a focus on underserved communities. Over the last year, I've had the privilege of traveling across the country, from Jackson, Mississippi to East Palestine, Ohio. I've visited communities in many of your states and have seen firsthand the environmental and public health challenges many of your constituents continue to experience. I've spoken to families who have been sickened by the air they breathe. I've met with people who live with toxic waste in their backyards. I've seen conditions in this country that are simply unacceptable in the United States of America. From investing in our nation's climate resilience to cleaning up contaminated land and water, there is no shortage of important work to be done. And members of the committee, EPA is up for the task. We're eager to work with all of you to deliver for our fellow Americans and to secure our nation's global competitiveness. But we need your support. Both the urgency and economic opportunity presented by climate change require that we leave no stone unturned. And we know the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies have not always ensured the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. In FY 2024, EPA requests additional funding and staff for the Environmental Justice Program. The funding will help to expand support for community-based organizations, indigenous organizations, tribes, states, local governments, and territorial governments, so that they can develop and implement solutions to their environmental justice concerns through our multi-partner collaborations. The FY 2024 President's Budget positions the EPA to create durable environmental policy, investing in America and setting our nation on a path to win the 21st century. It will allow for us to meet the pressing needs faced by millions of Americans and fundamentally improve people's lives for the better. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to submit this testimony for the record, and I look forward to our continued partnership to achieve these ambitious yet necessary goals, and I welcome all questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, thank you for being here today. I want to start off with something that I'm sure that you've never heard of before. Waters of the United States. And I'm going to ask this, it's going to sound a little partisan. I don't mean it to be, but it's just how I kind of view things. This administration has been actively trying to repeal anything that has Trump anywhere near it, whether it was the Trump EPA or the Trump rule at the borders or the Trump this or the Trump that. I mean, look at what happened within an hour after the president was sworn in. It was, what was it, 36 executive orders repealing Trump stuff. It's worked real well at the border. I want to know what you found was lacking in the Trump rule on waters of the United States that you had to correct. And I hope it wasn't getting Trump's name off of the Trump rule that was written during his period of time. Secondly, why in the world would you issue the WOTUS rule when a major case is before the Supreme Court? It's almost like you're trying to sway the Supreme Court or saying, to hell with you, this is what we're going to do. Why wouldn't you sit back and say, okay, we've written it, we think this is what we got to do. Let's see what the court says, because we may have to change it some or we might not. But right now, my fear is this. 2 years from now, we have a different administration. Now we got a different WOTUS rule. And it just goes on and on. This doesn't seem to be like that big of a problem to try and solve. I mean, we're trying to redefine what waters of the United States are because the court said, I don't know what navigable water means. We ought to be able to solve this damn problem. I've been working on it or at least dealing with it for 24 years since I've been in Congress. So I'll let you respond to that venting.
No, I appreciate the question, and I come to this from the perspective of a former state regulator that had the challenge of trying to implement the Obama WOTUS rule and then try to implement the Trump WOTUS rule. Let me start by saying that this is very different from both. The Trump rule was vacated nationally by multiple courts, so there was no basis for us to move from. It was vacated nationally by multiple courts. This rule that we're proposing is much more balanced and narrow than the Obama rule. So I've engaged with more of our ag constituency than any administrator in modern history. And what I learned from that was what could we do to improve upon the lack of an existing rule. So we went back to 2015, and then we codified what we consider to be streamlined interpretations of 2 Supreme Court rulings. And then based on the engagement that we had, we created or clarified exclusions that support farmers, like prior converted cropland, and for ranchers like artificial ponds used as drinking water for their herds. We also simplified and narrowed the test that the Supreme Court set to make it easier to determine which waters are covered and which aren't. And then we embedded exemptions for normal agricultural activity, regardless of whether they're covered by waters or not. So these are just a few of the reasons why the U.S. Department of Agriculture supported this rule. I think Secretary Vilsack said from day one, you've got to follow the rule, but we need for you to engage, and we need to improve upon this rule. So we didn't wait because there was nothing for us to wait on because the previous rule had been vacated by multiple courts at a national level. There are also some aspects of this rule that the Sackett case won't touch. And so what we decided to do was move forward, try to codify a number of exemptions that were requested of us by the agricultural community. And I obviously respect the Supreme Court's position. I will respect the Supreme Court's ruling. What we have now is we can adjust. If the Supreme Court rules this summer, we will adjust this rule and we will move forward in a much more expeditious way than waiting until June and then starting a 2 to 3 year rulemaking process. So I think we are ahead of the curve in terms of having the framework for moving forward. The Sackett case may or may not have some impact on that. Whatever that ruling is, we will build it in and continue to move in addition to those exemptions that we built in.
You need to come to Idaho and speak to some farmers, because I will tell you, and these are not extremist farmers, they're not MAGA farmers.
Sure.
They're everyday people who are concerned that it is going to substantially affect their ability to produce on their farms and stuff. And there are states who believe that the EPA is trying to take over the state's traditional role in waters of the United States. And that essentially the EPA wants to control all the waters.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I hear from a lot of things. But later on, I'll tell you a good thing about the EPA, too. So my time's up, Ms. Pingree.
I'll defer to Ranking Member Ladoro.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Administrator. First of all, I want to just say thanks for really responding to the letter that I sent asking for your assessment of what, going back to 2022, a 2022 budget, what effect would that have on a 2024 budget? Because there are some of my Republican colleagues are calling for that. And so, and what I'm particularly concerned about is what the cuts mean for American families. So we're talking roughly, and it could be more, it's a 22% cut. EPA's funding would go down to about $7.9 billion, the lowest level since 2013. What impact does the agency foresee on its work were we to revote funding to the fiscal 2022 levels? Can you elaborate on some of the examples you provided in your letter?
Absolutely. I think that I'll continue with the theme of our agriculture community. We find ourselves over the past 50 years struggling with the Endangered Species Act. Mm-hmm. Now we found ourselves entangled with the courts and the courts putting us on deadlines. I don't believe that any farmer should have to wake up to a court ruling and a court decide what tools a farmer can use to grow food, fuel, and fiber in this country. If we are going to get new pesticides and new herbicides registered, we have to have the workforce to do that. And so while we're taking pesticides and herbicides off the market, we need to be replacing them. So it will set back our agriculture community. I think the task of TSCA and looking at how we handle toxics in this country, if we are set back in this budget, we will not be able to accomplish what the bipartisan legislation set out for us to do in 2016. Mm-hmm. You're talking about $100+ million cut in our PFAS work, which, you know, I, as a former state secretary in North Carolina, I visited 90 of our 100 counties, red, blue, and independent counties. PFAS is indiscriminate, especially with our small rural communities. And forever. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing the harmful impacts of that. So those are just three examples of, you know, the bread and butter aspects of EPA is to protect public health and the environment. That would significantly hamper our ability to do so.
Just quickly, have my colleagues on the other side of the aisle made any similar requests for information about the impact of the cuts they intend to make? Is that yes or no?
You know, I'm not quite certain, but I've had a lot of conversations on both sides of the aisle about why this budget is important.
Okay, great. I have a quick question, which is parochial. The Long Island Sound, ecological treasure, health of my state depends on it. Home to thousands of species of wildlife, is an engine for our state's economy. Over the years, I've been successful in advocating, and this on a bipartisan basis. We've been successful in advocating for securing investments in the Long Island Sound. But I am concerned about the deep cuts to the program that rolls back the significant progress we've made in the health and the well-being of the Long Island Sound. You stated in your letter that cuts as high as $95 million could come from the geographic programs. And I might add, the Long Island Sound is not just it's just one of the geographic programs. We're looking at the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Gulf of Mexico, San Francisco Bay, Chesapeake Bay, Lake Pontchartrain, South Florida, just to name a few, so that this is just not one area of the country. So what kind of an environmental economic impact would the cut have on communities located near these water bodies of national significance?
Well, we're talking about a significant decrease in our ability to protect water quality for one of the most densely populated areas of the country. 9 million people living near the watershed. We appreciate your leadership in the $8.6 million increase. This is a great example of how we can improve our economy while improving public health and our ecosystems. Tourism, watershed protection, water quality protection. This is critical, and so if we don't get these resources, obviously it significantly hampers our ability to continue to pour in those tourism dollars, because we have a threat to the water quality, not just for drinking, but for recreation as well.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I will answer one of your questions. Yes, hadn't sent them a letter, but I have talked to the heads of all the different agencies about the impacts and
I
stuff. so-
appreciate that very, very much, because I think it's, just to say this one thing, Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I think sometimes phrases sound very good. Let's cut back to 22 for 24, and people say, okay, so forth. But I think it's incumbent on us, both sides of the aisle, for us to take a look at what that means and how that gets translated into very, very critical issues in every one of the appropriations bills.
I would agree with that,
Thank
and I have no problem with that. The other thing we're trying to look at is trying to slow down inflation. And inflation has been caused by all the excessive spending that's gone on. But that's not,
Well, no, that's
neither here
another,
nor there.
we'll have that discussion at another
Yeah,
point.
we'll have that
Mr.
discussion
Chair.
another
Right.
time. Ms. Pink?
Right.
Your side was here first.
So there. Thank you very much. I'm going to just continue a little bit on this same tack here. Can you just give me a sense about the environmental justice and where we would see rollbacks there? It's been so impressive to see the work that your organization has done and with the funding we've had available. But if we had these cuts and went back to 2022, how would that set back environmental justice?
Well, it would set it back significantly, and I say that because whether it's Lowndes County, Alabama, or McDowell County, West Virginia, and Appalachia, I've been visiting communities all across this country, tribal communities as well. There are a lot of communities in this country in 2023 that just don't have access to clean drinking water. In McDowell County, West Virginia, visiting a community with lack of access to water infrastructure, mothers using contaminated creek water for baby formula. There are some serious issues. And so when we see these disparities because of income or because of the rural nature of these communities or because of race, we are not equally protecting all people in this country. We're not equally involving all people in this country. So the environmental justice resources really does serve as a rising tide for everyone so that this country can be as great as it should be.
Thank you for that. Just to follow up a little bit on the staffing, I know you mentioned that before, and thank you for mentioning some of the things like pesticide review. We hear about that, no matter where you stand on those things, people want assurance, they want a decision made quickly. But we're still operating at the EPA at Reagan level, or we are at Reagan level staffing levels, and I know you've been working hard to get those numbers back up. You're requesting us to get up to 17,000 full-time equivalents. Can you talk to us a little bit as these climate change and other challenges increase? Why is it so important to get to those staffing levels, and sort of where are we in making that happen?
We're making tremendous progress with the resources that we've been given over the past year or so. Listen, we're facing 21st century challenges with resources of the past. It's just plain and simple. And so when we try to make up that ground that the market is requiring, farmers want new registrants and new pesticides on the market. We have to respond to, we proposed a regulation and a supplemental regulation for methane because the industry asked for us to do that, because the trade associations asked for us to do that. We have to have the technical staff and the ability to look at how to design a regulation that's innovative, high-tech, uses artificial intelligence, robots, and the like, not only because we're trying to save the product itself from being wasted, but we're trying to reduce those methane emissions. If we don't have the staff to have the conversations with industry to keep pace with the market and technology, then we're not doing our job. And by the way, whether it's the power sector or the agriculture sector, they're asking for us to engage and to keep pace with an evolving economy of the 21st century. We need the staff to do that, and we can't do that with Reagan-era numbers.
Thank you for that. I still have a little more time, so I'm going to bring up a completely unrelated topic, but something that I've gotten very interested in. In 2018, the EPA estimated that over 100 billion garments are produced annually, most of which end up incinerators or landfills. This generates about 17 million tons of textile municipal solid waste, an issue that we know concerns municipalities and the increasing cost of waste. Unfortunately, the National Recycling Strategy does not address this critical source of pollution and waste. Is it a focus area at all for the EPA? And if so, what programs or activities are you undertaking that either reduce textile waste or encourage textile recycling?
Well, it's a great question, and as I travel the world, second to climate change, this is the issue that most young people are focused on. And we are very focused on it in a voluntary way. We're designing our recycling programs that really do begin to address these issues and some of the market constraints that we're seeing. We've got a transformative vision for our waste management system, and we've released a series of strategic strategies or strategic goals that really do underpin the circular economy. We're excited about it because there are things that we can do on a regulatory and voluntary basis to reduce waste, which we all know reduces some of that strain and capacity on some of our local governments. But it also gives us the ability to reduce methane and other harmful pollutants that come from these landfills.
Great. Well, I'll look forward to looking at your strategy. And I know, as you said, it's an issue that young people talk to us about a lot, usually calling it fast fashion or slow fashion, but the idea that so much of the waste that we produce ends up either in the ocean, as plastic pollutions are all over the world and no one wants our waste anymore. These are important issues to address. So thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmore.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being back with us. Before we kicked off the hearing, I mentioned to you the importance of Puget Sound to my region economically, to our federally recognized tribes, to treaty reserve fishing rights. It's a really important body of water. Unfortunately, it's a sick body of water, and the EPA has played a really important role in trying to recover the sound. I want to thank Deputy Administrator McCabe for coming out to our neck of the woods. I want to issue again a standing invitation to you. It's really nice in the summer in our area. But I just want to underscore the urgency of this and having the EPA with skin in the game. We can't get it done without you. At the end of last year, the Puget SOS Act was signed into law to set up a Puget Sound Recovery National Program Office in EPA and to codify the Federal Leadership Task Force that will ensure that the entire alphabet soup of federal agencies is working hand in glove with the folks on the ground in our region to move forward and advance progress toward Puget Sound recovery. Just hoping to get a sense from you on how the rollout of that office and task force is progressing. And I want to also just say thank you for including Puget Sound and the geographic program in the testimony that you submitted.
Well, thank you for that question, and Deputy Administrator McCabe enjoyed the visit and made me regret not taking that visit, but we were a little tied up. The Puget Sound obviously is a national treasure, and we take it very seriously in terms of the protection of it. We also take very serious the President's charge to look at a whole-of-government approach, leverage all of our resources so that we're not wasting resources, but we're maximizing that opportunity. Of the FY23 increase of $20 million, $17 million of that is immediately going towards strategic initiative-led cooperative agreements that we have for safe shellfish habitat and stormwater projects. with our Washington State partners. For our tribal partners, Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission is working already to finalize work plans for each of the tribes in the next couple of months for the on-the-ground tribal-led projects. And so we plan to announce a second round of that funding this month. So we're seeing significant progress. We're seeing significant leverage resources, and we're seeing significant leverage partnerships. Again, as a former state regulator, I understand that the federal government has a role to play, but states and local governments have an even more important role to play, know their communities better than we ever could, so those partnerships are really important.
Would love to follow up with you and your team on the implementation side of the Puget SOS Act, and just as that's rolling out, making sure that we're hitting the ground running.
Okay.
I want to raise one other issue, and if you do come out, and Chairman, I know you said you might want to come out to our neck of the woods too. There is a lab doing research looking at what's killing fish, and one of the things that they found was a chemical called 6-PPD quinone, which is used in tires. It's an anti-ozonant that interacts with ozone, runs into our streams, and kills fish. And they actually showed a video of it. It's crazy. Just this polluted stormwater, within seconds, the salmon just die. And there's more research required on this to understand the impact of this chemical, and federal funding needed. You mentioned stormwater to try to make sure this chemical isn't ending up in our rivers. Can you give me any sense of what EPA is doing to combat the impacts of this 6-PPD quinone, and what resources you might need to potentially review alternatives to this chemical that hopefully won't kill fish?
Yeah, absolutely. I think last year, Deputy Administrator McCabe helped kick off a cross-EPA work group consisting of just about every leader from every media office at EPA, including Region 10. And so we're working very closely with Washington Ecology on this issue. So through some EPA funding already, we've established a critical link between that chemical additive in tire dust and salmon deaths in the Puget Sound region. So we're continuing to fund research activities on impacts to salmon, but also to other fish species. We need the resources to continue to invest in this research because there is a critical link. And again, that critical link just doesn't identify an ecological piece of degradation. There's also an economic, there's a cultural piece to that for those who require salmon for sustenance and the like. So cultural, economic, ecological, we need to do the research, and we need to have a replacement chemical.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hart.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and thank you to Administrator Reagan and Mr. Amin for being here. I want to talk about how we can mitigate poor air quality. My region last year received an F grade for air pollution standards. Frankly, if grades were any worse than F, we would have gone all the way to Z. We have the worst air quality in America. I grew up with childhood asthma. My brother grew up with childhood asthma, and I refuse to let my daughter deal with the same air quality or even worse than what I did. We've been trying to take action. In 2018, the San Joaquin County Air District submitted a plan. It took the EPA 4 years to review that plan. During that 4 years, while the EPA was reviewing what we could do to improve our air quality, more than 4,000 adults had their lives cut short by poor air quality just in our region. I would have hoped that it happened sooner, but in the end, the EPA staff recommended approval of our plan, but then politics intervened, and that plan ended up getting rejected just last year, October 22. Now we're in process trying to figure out what happens next. And you know this process better than I. The first sanctions are going to take effect in June. My understanding is the transportation funding sanctions will take effect in December of this year. That could lead to billions of dollars of transportation funding lost in our district, which already doesn't get our fair share of federal resources. Obviously, we want to do everything we can to fix this before we become where we're on track to be, which is the first time in U.S. history that a community would be subject to penalties this severe. We want to be part of the solution. What recommendations do you have for our air quality district and others, and what's the ideal timeline for a plan of action?
Well, I appreciate that question, and I do know that the San Joaquin Valley faces some of the most difficult air quality challenges in the country. So I want you to know that we're taking this very serious, and we also take sanctions very serious, which is why we've been engaging with the district. It's my understanding that we've been having some really good conversations, and we actually expect the district to submit a new contingency measure plan in the next couple of months. Once we get that plan, we anticipate that because we've worked on it together, that will be approved, and then that will stop the sanctions clock while we continue to tackle this issue of getting SIP approval. I think in addition to some local measures that are being contemplated by both EPA and the district, we also have a series of technology standards that are coming out nationwide that we think will also benefit the region, primarily focusing on transportation. But we also have some others that are coming out as well. So I anticipate that a combination of both federal action, state and local action will help to get us closer to remedying the San Joaquin Valley problem.
I hope you're right. I think my concern about that timeline is that it cuts it really short. And what I just heard from you is, we're now almost in April. The first sanctions are taking place in June. If it takes us months to come up with a plan, we're going to be at risk of losing a lot of resources that our community desperately needs. So we're happy to help. I know you're in direct conversations as well, but my office stands ready to assist because we want to get this to a resolution. But I also think we should have been able to anticipate this and get it fixed, frankly, years before. It shouldn't take 4 years to get to this process. I know you weren't the administrator that whole time. But this is a process that has been very slow and very opaque from an air district that I think wants to help, and certainly from an office like ours that desperately wants to do more to address air quality. What does the EPA need to make these sorts of processes faster so it doesn't take 4 years, and even better, to help give enough guidance to air districts about what they need to get right the first time so they don't end up at risk of sanctions and, frankly, catastrophe when you look at what those resources would do to an area like ours?
I think that when you look at a diverse constituency like your district, I think that's where these environmental justice dollars will come in handy, because the majority of these environmental justice dollars are going to state and local governments. Because of the lack of meaningful engagement of many of the constituents in your district, that's where the threat comes from for litigation if we're going to approve a SIP that doesn't equally protect everyone on the ground. And so there is an education and outreach component to how the state builds these state implementation plans that are then submitted to EPA. I think we have to follow the science, but I also think we have to follow the law, and we have to approve plans that we know are not vulnerable to litigation. I think that's what we're doing right now.
Okay, well, if you need more people, if you need more regulatory authority, let us know. We want to make sure that we're anticipating these sorts of problems as early as possible and being part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank
Get
you.
back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple comments. You said you travel the world. That got my interest. How many trips have you done overseas?
I believe we've been to 6 countries, maybe 6 or 7 countries.
Have you taken commercial air on all of them?
Yes.
Good. That's what I like to hear. So you're also concerned about the toxic waste in the backyard, your comment. Have you been to Palestine, Ohio?
I have 3 times.
And what did you find?
I found a community that's been traumatized. And luckily for us, we were there within a matter of hours after the accident. We've been on the ground since day 1. And we've, done what we think is good state-federal cooperation, which is support the state of Ohio on the initial emergency response. We did air testing and water testing. And then EPA took its federally appropriate role, which is to begin to look at the cleanup aspects. Okay. And that's where we start the leadership role.
My understanding is the railroad has the lead on cleanup. Is that true?
I'm sorry?
The railroad has the lead on cleanup. Is that
They
true?
have the accountability and the obligation, yes, to clean up the mess they caused.
Okay, let's switch to Montana. You ever been to Montana?
I have not.
Well, it's amazing that you had said that the states have an important role, and you visited all sorts of people that support Waters of the U.S. Have you talked to the Montana stock growers?
I'm not quite sure if I have or not.
Okay, how
I've
about
talked
the-
to
how about the Montana
Bureau.
Farm Bureau?
Yes, we have.
How about the Montana wheat growers? You
I'd
personally,
have to
because you
go
said
back-
you have.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the list.
Beet growers, I could go on the whole list. And from my perspective, what they're telling me is, Waters of the U.S., you know where the Yellowstone River is? You've never been there. Do you know where the Yellowstone River is outside of the Yellowstone series?
I don't.
All right. Well, how is it that you think you can manage the Yellowstone River if you don't know where it is? Because you want to manage the water flow, the temperature, the riparian bank, wildlife in, wildlife out, by Waters of the U.S., intermittent streams, cow ponds, vernal pools. So how is it that you think you're in a position to manage our water in Montana when you haven't been there?
Well, first, I don't want to make it personal. I don't want to manage it. But I do want to follow the law and the Clean Water Act.
Do you believe that WOTUS is a law or a rule, first of all?
First of all, well, the waters of the U.S. is a rule,
Yes,
right?
it
that
is.
we have to promulgate.
But you
That
said you would
is a-
work in coordination with the states, and you haven't been to Montana. You haven't addressed the state of Montana, the governor's office, or anyone in there. And I can list all the farmers that you say that support this thing, and there isn't a one of them that I know that supports Water of the U.S.
I can-
Your rule, sir.
I can cop to saying I don't have the budget or the time to visit all 50 states. That is true. What I can say, though, is that I have engaged heavily with Zippy Duval and the Farm Bureau. I've engaged with numbers of Farm Bureau presidents all across this country. For my nomination, I was endorsed by most of the elected agriculture commissioners across this country. My grandfather was a farmer. I come from Eastern North Carolina. Again, as a former state secretary, I attempted to implement both versions of this rule. So I understand the frustration. My point is that I attempted to look at what we've learned over the past two administrations, take into consideration what two Supreme Court justices have said, looked at how the courts have weighed in over the past 5 to 7 years, and thread a needle to codify exemptions and exclusions that we were asked directly to do, while also looking at how we narrow that
you
definition.
Said, who asked? Who asked you for this rule?
They asked for the exemptions and exclusions. in the
Who
rule.
asked you to implement and form the Waters of the U.S. rule? Who in the West?
Well-
which governor, which organization asked you to do the Waters of the U.S. rule?
But by law, we have to promulgate a rule. Remember, the courts vacated,
Oh, I know.
nationally vacated the previous administration's rule.
But when you put a rule, wouldn't it be better to actually talk to the governor's office, talk to Idaho, talk to Utah, talk to the people that actually live out there? Now, I understand there's a lot of difference between the East and West Coast, and I appreciate that. And I wear a cowboy hat because I think our cowboy lifestyle is under a little attack. But I want to work with you. But what we see as the rule is an infringement on states' rights, and it worries a lot of farmers. And as you know in your farming business, there ain't no money in cattle. You pay for the lifestyle.
Sure.
And when people see a threat on their lifestyle, they get a lot of upset. In Montana, we're really upset about it because we don't see that path separates what we see as an overreach. And I want your commitment. You'll work with us on this because it's a very sensitive issue, and you've heard it before. Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. So I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Administrator. Thanks for being with us. I got to tell you, I'm impressed with you as a witness and the work you're doing. This would be, I think, a difficult environment because you come here and you generally maybe have some idea, but you don't know what we're going to ask you or what we're going to talk to you about. And you seem to have a remarkable working knowledge of being able to talk about these different topics. So thank you for that. And I don't mean to beat a dead horse, as they say, but I got to emphasize the waters of the U.S. if I could. And maybe I won't ask you a comment. Maybe I will. But to help you understand, and I think you do, but to reinforce for you, it's difficult to appreciate what this rule means to people in the West. You're from a very beautiful state, but you have lots of water. You go out west, and I mean, it's so precious. And as Secretary Zinke has said, there's probably nothing that's more divisive and more contentious than is this rule in the West with farmers and ranchers. And it's because they feel like their entire livelihood, but not just how they feed their families, but the preservation of the culture, the thing that they've chosen to do, which means so much to them, could literally be taken away by the stroke of a pen by someone who doesn't understand or appreciate what that stroke of the pen meant for them. And for many times for something they say, what was the benefit? How is this rule benefiting, or preserving? And the first time we met, I asked you about this, and you said, well, your rule of the waters, what you expect a new rule would be very different than President Obama's rule. You've indicated the same thing here. What would you say to a farmer or rancher who, has these same fears, and in their mind or their application, it seems like it's much the same as what the previous rule was? And if you would answer briefly, because there's one other issue I'd like to address with you, please.
I think I'd say that we want to do the best job we can to talk about this rule and what's actually in the rule. There is a reason that Secretary Vilsack supported it, and he is being very supportive in looking at how we can do some co-resource location on the implementation of this rule. Listen, the first listening session I did on this rule was in North Dakota. Then I went to Iowa. Listen, trying to regulate streams and rivers and ponds and ditches in North Carolina and Nevada is almost impossible. So the goal was to look at what the Clean Water Act requires for us to do by law, and also look at how we can really leverage our state partners and codify as many of these exemptions as possible, and then work with USDA to be sure that we're implementing the law and the rule, implementing the rule in a way that people can actually understand it. It's a difficult task.
It is, and I could counter with you, but I'm going to leave it at this, and that is, please, you need to understand and come back and talk to folks about what this means to people out west and why it's so threatening to them. If I could switch gears to Quad O, the super emitter program, which, as I understand it, deputizes third-party entities to essentially go out and monitor oil and gas emissions. Are you familiar with this? And
I'm not familiar with that exact program.
okay. Well, I'm going to ask you to follow up with this if you would, because, I mean, this rule, as we understand it, essentially, as I said, it deputizes third-party individuals to go out and to kind of the, third-party entities to go out and do what clearly the federal government should do, and if not, they have the authority to defer some of that authority to the states, but certainly not to third parties. And if we were to use third parties for that, there's no question that environmental and activist groups would use that as an opportunity and would provide data that we had no idea whether that data is accurate or not. Follow up with us, will you? My office is going to reach out.
Okay.
If this is what we think it is, this idea of a citizen scientist, there's no authority for it at all. It's going to break down trust, and we have no reason to know if we can trust the data or not we'd be getting from that. So we'll follow up with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Administrator. It's nice to hear your testimony. I want to start first with the Carson River Mercury cleanup. I would like to know from your office who your point person is going to be, whether that's a Region 9 person or whoever, for purposes of interacting with what they're going to do, how they're going to coordinate with the state DEP folks that your office has been coordinating with for a while, just so we have a real A to Z understanding of who the contractor is, what you're going to do, what the methodology is,
Yes.
all that other sort of stuff. Because when you talk about mercury and other things embedded in a river for well over 100 years, which is not ideal, obviously, but when you talk about dredging the full length of the river up and replacing it, that's a huge thing in terms of dislodging and making contamination more friable, if you will, to a reservoir down.
Yes.
So it's like all those things, just be nice to have a comprehensive cradle-to-grave understanding of, here's the plan now that EPA's going to take the primary position and hire people, and people are going to be in the river doing stuff. We'd like
Yes.
to make sure we understand that. So that's a please, and we'll look forward to working with your folks to get up to speed on that as soon as possible. I want to follow up on, Mr. Stewart said beat a dead horse, and it's like, well, we won't go there. But when you talk about the Intermountain West, in my portion of it, that's 12 inches of rain a year. When you talk about clean water and clean air and clean soil and all that stuff, that's a different proposition, with all due respect to my colleagues from places which experience much more water
Yes.
during the year. And I know, I appreciate that one size doesn't fit all. It's like, I'm not gonna go manage it for one county in Nevada or Montana or whatever. But when it represents about a third of the land area of the country, I think it's worthy of being able to say, when somebody like me starts pointing his finger at you, for you to say, we have engaged in the Great Basin, we have engaged in the Intermountain West, here's what we know, here's why it's not the same as the Chesapeake Bay, or Maine, or you know, up in the North Plains or something like that. Because those folks out there intuitively know that, I mean, you don't gotta tell somebody a place that averages 12 inches of water a year how important water is. So when you step back from that role for a minute and go, do these people benefit from playing fast and loose with water quality and what they're doing with it? Heck no, or they wouldn't be in the business. Do they benefit from dirty air? Do they benefit from breaking the rules? Obviously not. But they like to know that when it's time to talk about the rules, that what they're doing right, if anything, is being acknowledged and taken care of, so that when I go to your folks at Region 9 and say, tell me how you're gonna implement this new rule. Are you gonna have field handbooks? Who's gonna be doing it? You're gonna visit the sites? What are you doing to bring that to the ground? And we're gonna do the same thing with the Corps of Engineers out in that neighborhood, which is out of Sacramento. It's like, so how are you implementing this? Because I'll be honest with you, it doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
But you know what? Maybe I'm wrong. Which is why we wanna know how you're actually gonna do it. And so the challenge for you is, that infrastructure's been there for decades. Corps in Sacramento, Region 9 in San Francisco. We just expect that when those people are there, that they're not getting a long ways away centric on how to deal with those resources. Not that they're not just as important everywhere, but dealing with them correctly in the Intermountain West, in high arid places, with all due respect, is not the same as other areas.
Yes.
And so what I'd like to be able to do after doing my homework is to go back to those people like Mr. Zinke's talking about in his neighborhood and whatever, and say, here's what they're doing in Region 9, and here's how they're interacting with you. And obviously you can't pollute the water, and you can't pollute the air, you can't pollute the anything, but it feels like a long ways away, and I get the whole of government approach stuff, and it's like, that's good. But the whole of government approach in the Intermountain West is a little different than the whole of government approach in the Southeast, the Northeast, the Appalachians, whatever.
Yes.
So I look forward to getting together with your folks and making sure that everybody has the maximum amount of knowledge possible regarding the rule.
You can count on that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Was that a question?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Did you miss the question mark at the end?
Yeah, I was looking for it in there. Ms. McCullough.
Thank you, and I appreciate the fact, Administrator Regan, that you haven't been able to be everywhere. But I have fished on the Yellowstone, and there's a beautiful little town called Glendive, Montana. As you're going through, stop and visit it. I think Mr. Zinke would agree with me. It's a charming little town. It was built because of the Pacific Northern Railroad. The Empire Builder goes through there.
My dad was born in Glendale.
Yeah, so it's a great little town.
Or stay on the tracks.
So then we talked about the Yellowstone. Now I talk about the Mississippi River, and I haven't been every place on the Mississippi River yet either. But I want to just thank you for the work that the EPA, working with other federal agencies, doing is to protect, working to protect 20 million people who drink Mississippi River water. And as we see more water shortages, and that's what you're trying to avoid with Waters of the USA, to make sure that everyone has access to clean, safe drinking water, as well as that Mississippi's a working river with barges, farms, and then recreation. I really appreciate the collaboration that you've been doing. Right now, it looks like the St. Croix River is going to have more flooding than the Mississippi, but I don't know what's going to happen downstream later on this spring. So your work on helping us work to be more resilient on the river, working with communities that have been disadvantaged either with pollution or other things that have happened in the past, and that is really greatly appreciated. My office is going to follow up with you on that, and we have some legislation that we've been working with the League of Counties, the League of Cities, and other community leaders up and down the mighty Mississippi on that. But I just want to follow up a little bit about two things that I work a lot on. Being on the Defense Committee, I work a lot on PFAS. You work a lot on PFAS. I know some of the work that we're doing to find out how to break this chemical down is a DOD EPA collaboration looking at things right now. And so as we work on the defense budget, I'd like to know who in the EPA I can reach out and talk to about PFAS and some of the research and R&D are going on. So these two committees can work in unison to get the biggest bang for the buck on what to do on this. But I'm concerned about what could happen with the EPA's budget, and I know people sometimes love to hate the EPA, but I got to see the EPA work firsthand, and they asked about the Ohio derailment when I had a plating factory that had been abandoned, and the St. Paul Police and St. Paul Fire had been watching it the best that they could, and we saw kids were breaking in there, and the roof was falling in, and it was bad. It was really bad. And the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and our office were talking, and they said, we've called the EPA. Our fire department, our police department, the houses that lived adjacent to that plating factory, the trust that you installed with everyone as you cleaned that up, thank God you were there. And as you're seeing more and more of these places become identifiable, where local communities, even states can't handle some of this stuff, and the emergency teams that leave their families come out and work with really dangerous stuff. Every day, the EPA left a note for our fire department, and I'm going to call it the rescue cart. That what to do first if something goes bad here was updated, and our fire department felt very, very supported in that. But we had a full-time professional fire department. You go places where there isn't even that available.
That's right.
What would a budget cut to 22 mean to what I'm starting to, because I'm like all into you guys now, I'm reading about these hazmat teams all the time. What would that do? Because we're finding more and more of this pollution around. Work on the PFAS, we'll keep that one separate, we'll work on that, but just what you're finding now and with these trail derailments,
Yes.
that costs a lot of money.
Well, we're working from a deficit already in terms of public trust. I think we all are. And so I want to be clear that 85% of the budget increase that we're asking for goes to state, tribal, and local partners. That helps us to build this credibility on the ground. We do have the technical ability. We do have the expertise. But when we talk about these relationships, it's really the resources that we provide to state agencies and local agencies that really grease the skids for us to build that trust. We are able, with technology, to detect levels of pollution that we've never been able to detect before, whether it's in drinking water or whether it's in soil. We have an obligation, once a community identifies a contamination, we have an obligation to clean that up. And so when you do have a situation like East Palestine, you don't want to find yourself short of resources. You need resources to go in to respond to the emergency, to clean up the emergency, to be able to do risk communication, to build trust with the community. And even with East Palestine, there are things that scientifically we didn't think we needed to do, but I visited 3 times. I met with small businesses, and they said, please test for things even if you don't believe there's a health impact, because we need that confidence to rebuild the local economy and to rebuild trust. And we sent people in to test. We opened up a storefront in East Palestine where people can come in and get information, and we're going to make this company toe the line. We're going to hold them accountable. We need enforcement dollars to hold bad actors like Norfolk Southern accountable. They created the mess. We have to make sure that they clean it up. And so if we roll back these budgetary dollars, we're going to find ourselves in a world of trouble.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. They do amazing work.
Thank you. I would say something good about the EPA. I actually like the EPA. during one campaign. I remember my opponent was saying, this is back when I was chairman before, just get rid of the EPA. We don't need the damn EPA anymore, you know? It was the biggest applause line of the whole campaign. Everybody in the audience was applauding. I said, well, I don't know. The Cuyahoga River hasn't started on fire spontaneously, you know, and you can actually drive through Los Angeles without tears running down your cheeks from the smog and stuff. So the EPA has done some good things. But so I have defended you in the past. There's and I don't know how much you know about the Dixie Drain in Boise, Idaho.
No,
You ever heard about it?
I have not.
It's a fascinating thing that happened. The EPA came in and said, you've got to reduce your phosphates, nitrates out of it's going into the Boise River, city of Boise. It would have been hugely expensive. City engineers came up with a different plan. They worked with the state of Idaho, they worked with Region 10, and it's called the Dixie Drain. And EPA looked at it and said, you know, we think this will work. So they went ahead and did it, and it's about 1/10 of the cost of what it would have cost, and it's working fantastically. In fact, what the Region 10 people said, you know, this could be the model for some other places where it might work to do this type of thing. If you ever get a chance to get out to Boise, which, you know, why wouldn't you go to Boise? You know? I mean,
Is that an invitation?
yeah, anytime. I'll go with you. But and so the EPA was flexible in allowing local communities to come up with plans that are alternatives that might work. Sometimes it doesn't mean they always will, but I was proud to work with the EPA and the state of Idaho and the city of Boise to do that. So there are good things too. Now, about everything that's going to happen if we go back to 2022 levels and all the damage that's going to be done, your annual appropriation is about $10 billion. Last year alone, the EPA received an additional $100 billion in supplemental funding. $100 billion, 10 times your annual appropriation. I want to ask specifically about the hiring that will occur with this money. As you know, this $100 billion is finite. It will run out. It's not going to last forever. We've learned that 742 new staff have been hired so far just through the infrastructure bill alone. When we spoke last week, you explained that only 0.5% of funding from the massive $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund included in the Inflation Reduction Act would go to hiring. That's still approximately 675 staff. And to be clear, this surge of hiring is separate from the President's budget request, which has proposed to add an additional 1,900 FTEs above the current hiring ceiling. I mean, you're staffing up big time. Sometimes with money that's going to disappear, but 1,900 new employees this next year. What's the total number of hiring that is estimated to take place just from the supplemental funding in the Infrastructure Bill and Inflation Reduction Act? And what does the agency plan to do with everyone that has been hired when this money is no longer available?
Yes.
Because we're going to hit an employee cliff.
Yes.
And I don't want it to. I won't be in Congress at that time, most likely. But I don't want a Congress to be sitting here going, man, if we do that, you know, we could increase your budget by 5% next year, and we're going to have to lay off 2,000 people. Mm-hmm. So, and it's not just this committee; it's all the committees, because of the huge addition of employees that went on in almost every department from the additional hiring with all the money we spent out there.
Yeah, I'd like to tackle that sort of from two angles. The first is the resources from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as you say, they will expire. It's a term limit there. And so a lot of the positions we're hiring to supplement those new laws are term limited as well. I'll get you the specific stat, but not all of the hires from those pieces of legislation are permanent hires. They are term limited as well. So we're trying to match the requirements of that law with the resources for the time frame.
So let me,
So
when they're
some of those-
hired, you're saying, you hire them and say, this job lasts 5 years and it's gone?
Those positions will sunset. Some 5, I can get you the specifics,
Okay.
but yes, those positions are what we call term limited, and will sunset. So all of them aren't permanent. You know, there are a lot of bread and butter issues that just aren't IRA and bill related. Emergency response, TSCA, looking at pesticides and herbicides, some of our enforcement actions. So what you'll see in the supplemental budget request is really trying to be sure that these mission critical issues that we're required by law to put in place can be sustained. And as we've discussed, I'll use Endangered Species Act as an example. We have the courts now that have tied us up that are basically taking products off the shelves. Well, we can litigate those things all we want, but in the meanwhile, we need to be green-lighting new products so that farmers have replacement tools. We need bodies to do that. 2016, you all passed a great bipartisan TSCA law. As we think about asbestos and some of these chemical compounds that just have no place in society, we're trying to catch up and execute and implement on those laws. And so, obviously, we can provide you all the details, but there are a lot of programs that just aren't IRA and bill related that really fit squarely into this budget request. And I'll just end with the environmental justice request. The majority of those positions go out into our regions and into the field. And they really are community engagement focused. And a lot of times, we don't really look at the full definition of environmental justice, and that's income, race, national origin. But there are just so many communities in this country, rural and urban, that have been left out, left behind, that face some pretty dire environmental consequences. We have to provide the resources and the infrastructure to be equally protective of all people in this country, and that's what we're trying to achieve in that program.
When you were a state regulator, did you ever look at the federal EPA and say, these guys are crazy?
You know, I mean, listen, despite some of the political rhetoric that we find ourselves engaged in, you know, I had a lot of success as a state regulator during the previous administration on some issues. When you talk about brownfields, redevelopment, and when you talk about looking at Superfund, North Carolina had a great program. It tied very well into the federal government. I haven't changed any of that. I know you opened with erasing Trump things. I think that when we look at PFAS, states like West Virginia and North Carolina and Michigan were on the front lines. We didn't get what we needed from the federal government. So I brought that expertise in, and we've tried to make up for some lost time. Waters of the U.S. is not something unique to this administration. As you said, it's a decades-old issue, and so we're going to keep at it. It's a tough conversation. I'm going to be honest and transparent about it, recognizing that it's going to be tough when I get questions from Mr. Zinke and others about it. But we're going to continue to engage. And so as a former state regulator, a lot of that perspective is what I bring to this job, and I recognize that there's a lot of value in having our states have autonomy to protect the state's natural resources and public health.
Well, I've always said, if you want to know the difference between the East and the West, in the East, they try to get rid of water. That's why they have riparian water rights. In the West, we try to save every drop of water, and that's why we have prior appropriation water rights, which is entirely different in how we treat water rights and stuff in the East and the West.
Yeah.
And consequently, I'm not sure the same rule works in all places, you know? So anyway, that's a discussion we'll have at another time. We've had quite a bit of that discussion so far, Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did check. Mr. Amadei said that he gets 12 inches of rain a year. We get 48 in Maine, so we get about 4 times as much water. So I guess we are in a whole different conversation, really. I'll just talk a little bit more about PFAS. You know, I'm not interested in being the expert in Congress on PFAS. I didn't want this to have to be an issue that I was, like, you know, focusing on all the time. But sometimes it's just no fun to be the state that's out there in the lead. And as you know, and you've been very good on this, you know, working with Maine, and we've just been in the forefront of dealing with our PFAS-related issues. So thank you for the step you took 2 weeks ago to deal with PFAS in drinking water. Really, really important step to take, I think, for public health across the nation. But I just want to describe a couple things to you. I actually came when we had our 2 hours in between hearings. I had a meeting with the Maine Municipal Association, so that's community leaders, city councilors and others. And we have a new situation in our state because we've been a leader in discovering the amount of PFAS that was in our agricultural land. We're now doing testing of agricultural soil, but one of the things the legislature passed last year was a law that said we can't spread municipal waste, sewage, biosolids on land anymore. So I think we're the first state in the nation to do that. And the downside of that is that now we've got all these municipal waste facilities that are having to truck this biosolids to landfills, and now our major landfills are saying we don't want it anymore. So now they're being confronted with massive increases in the cost per ton. Huge changes in their budgets that are just happening overnight. And my understanding is a lot of it's actually going to Canada, and we all know what happens when you try to ship your waste out of the country or to other states. Eventually, they'll say no. So I'm not even asking you to answer a question about it, but I just wanted to alert you that it's yet another challenge that if we're having to deal with, other states are having to deal with, and I don't know how to help them out financially. I don't know how we work through this issue so that we can figure out, is there a way to safely process those biosolids? Is there a way to test to see if some of them would be acceptable to, just spread in agricultural land. But right now, that's a prohibition that we're having, and I'm sure other states are going to look at the same kind of thing. So you may have a comment on that, but I guess at the same time, I'd just be interested to know what, if any, work, or can you update how you're looking at PFAS contamination in the soil? Because that's one of the biggest questions our farmers are now asking us. These are farmers who have tested positive, so they have high levels of PFAS contamination in their soil. A lot of them were organic farmers who've been working for years to have, high-quality farms. Now they've got to, stop selling. They're not sure what they're going to do. They're worried about their own family's health. But we don't really even know how to remove it from the soil. Are there certain crops we can grow or can't grow? What's safe levels in these crops? And I know I talked to Secretary Vilsack. Of course, we've sort of got it working on at the EPA and the USDA. But where are you in the sort of issue with soil?
Well, we're sort of knee deep in all of those, and it's sort of interesting for an EPA administrator to say, but my two buddies in administration are the Defense and USDA. PFAS has brought us together.
Defense has got all the money, by the way, so get Ms. McCollum to spend everything she can on it.
My first reaction to that and response to that was, in order for us to set these PFAS limits, I assured Secretary Vilsack that I would look at our enforcement discretion. Because what we want to do is keep focus on the bad actors, which are those who pollute, not our agriculture community, and not even our water utilities. We're all victims and forced to deal with this. And so keep the eye trained on those who have polluted, but also look at enforcement discretion. I think we can talk a little bit more, but in looking at our enforcement discretion, and how we exercise that, and not going after farmers, and looking at sort of how municipalities treat biosolids. I think if institutions or entities know that there isn't enforcement coming, it sort of creates a pause where we all can talk about, okay, now that we're not going to push enforcement, how do we deal with the solution? There are a lot of innovative ideas on the ground in different communities that we're having conversations with to see what the best management practices are. I'd love to continue to talk to you on that, but that's something that EPA and USDA are working very closely on. And again, Secretary Austin and I and Secretary Vilsack, we've been looking at this PFAS issue from day one as a whole of government approach.
It's good. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Critical minerals. We had a conversation with Secretary Holland this morning, an interesting one. But I would assume it's your policy to source critical minerals from ourselves or our allies rather than foreign countries like China and Russia.
I think we have to take a very good look at our permitting processes. The critical minerals are essential for this clean energy economy that we want to pursue. We cannot afford to be overly reliant on any foreign sources, and so we have to deal with how we look at critical minerals domestically. I believe from EPA's vantage point, we're doing the necessary things that we can to be sure that when we look at critical minerals and mining, that we do it in an ecologically and environmentally responsible way.
The report I have is that in order to catch up on where the demand is today, we would have to increase mining by 2,000% over a 20-year period. Seems like we're a little bit behind. And as you know, critical minerals are key to EV as well as defense. And we don't want to talk about defense, but it's it's critical on our ability to defend and strike. What I'm concerned about is it seems like we're running to the EV world without looking at the supply chain. So on the front is the supply chain of where do we get it, who processes it, and it turns out 62% from China, and in some cases they are the absolute monopoly over critical minerals which we need, let alone where they're sourced from in Africa and China. But I'm also concerned on the back end. You know, what are we going to do when the batteries are now done with their life cycle? Where are we going to put them? As you recall, we decided on the nuclear that we would build a national repository in Yucca. We spent $10 billion, 14, thank you, Mr. Chairman, $14 billion over 10 years. And the moment we build it and we're ready to turn the key on, not so fast. So now we store them at 128 distributed sites, which is unsafe for a number of reasons. Batteries. So here comes the batteries. My understanding is 90% of solar cells get deposited in some landfill somewhere across this country. 90%. And I can tell you, and I'm sure you know the list of toxins that are in those cells, and they're not good. Then let alone the batteries. So what's the plan on what are we going to do with these batteries? Are the administration moving towards a national repository site? Are we looking at regionally? Whose liability when you buy a Tesla and you buy the battery? Do you buy that liability too with a battery? And does that mean when you deposit it someplace, are you responsible for it as well? What's the plan, and what are you doing about the end state of EV world?
Yeah, I'd love to have a longer conversation with you where we could get our staffs together. I think I'm not quite sure about the 90% number, but what I can say is when I engage with industry, I think that there are going to be a lot more market corrections than we think. A lot of solar companies and these car companies are already designing programs to pull back these batteries and recycle them because they understand how expensive and energy intensive it can be to recreate new batteries, to recreate new solar panels. So there's a massive recycling wave that's been pushed by industry to pull back some of this.
I will agree, probable, but nothing I've seen is proven or affordable. And it seems like we're rushing, the government's buying EV vehicles, we're buying, and we have parking lots full of batteries, and put them in a landfill is not a good idea.
No.
Put them in a parking lot is not a good idea. It seems before we jump in this arena, and I think it's a mega trend. I think we're moving towards that. But before we do, I would get with your staff and figure out what's the plan.
Yeah.
I'm a military guy. I love a plan. But if we don't have a plan, I can tell you when we get there, it's not going to be what we think or oftentimes what we like. So I'd like your commitment to work with you on the back end of it to make sure we look at what resources are required, what interagency work we need to develop. And I'm sure that the chairman, I don't mean to speak for the minority, but I'm sure that's an area that's sensitive as well.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I yield
Thank
back.
you.
And thank you, by the way. Thank you for your service. I know it's not tough, and thank you for your service when you're in the Carolinas. And it's not easy being on the Hill, but thank you. And I rest assured that our staff will work with you.
Thank you, and it's good to see you again. I enjoyed your visit to North Carolina, I guess, a couple of years ago on another tough topic that we were engaged on.
We wrote the check. Promise made, promise kept.
That's right.
Let me just say on Mr. Zinke's question there, what are you going to do with, say, the batteries or the solar panels? I know where there's a $14 billion hole in the ground that we need to fill with something. I've told the Secretary of Energy not to cave that in because we're going to need a place to store the 52 or 53 Academy of Science studies that have been done on that. It's the most studied piece of ground in the world. But you know how that goes. We've been fighting for years. I want to ask you some fairly simple, quick questions. One, I was disappointed to see that the President's budget request proposed to zero out the funding for the Rural Water Technical Assistance Grants, which is currently funded at just over $30 million. Small communities across this country depend on this funding for technical assistance to help them learn how to meet or maintain federal water standards. And I've worked with these people in Idaho that do training for, a town of 2,000 has a hard time trying to keep up with what they have to do to meet the rural water, to meet the clean water standards and so forth. Given the program's proven success and longstanding bipartisan support, is it wise to eliminate this program?
I'll say two things. The first is nearly half of the $43 billion in SRF dollars must go out as grants or forgivable loans to disadvantaged communities, which includes a lot of rural communities. So we're providing already more than $150 million in technical assistance grants over the next 5 years. A lot of that is coming from bill dollars. So that money is going out, $150 million in technical assistance. That's why you don't see that money there, because we're getting it from another place.
I suspect you're going to see 30 million more in the next budget that's written, because I think Congress has good bipartisan support for that program. But another question: shortly after the administration released its national cybersecurity strategy, the EPA announced certain cybersecurity mandates for the water sector. We must secure the nation's water infrastructure, which is critical for public health and safety. There's an ongoing research and development associated with securing these systems and learning how to respond to an incident, including research and development at your water security test bed at the Idaho National Laboratory in Idaho. Can you please explain how the EPA plans to utilize the water security test bed to help public and private sector entities understand cyber risk and what to do, and what do you support expanding the test bed capabilities in the future?
Well, I can say that obviously cybersecurity is absolutely very important, and we're already, I think our teams are already talking about how research labs like the Idaho National Lab and the water security test bed is critical and essential for us. So I think we're already working together on that to expand those capabilities and look at what we can learn from Idaho, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. Last week during the Forest Service budget hearing, I asked Chief Moore about the repercussions of losing fire retardant as a tool to fight wildfires. There's a pending lawsuit that threatens to do just that. In fact, I joined my colleagues in introducing legislation to make sure that doesn't happen. Chief Moore told me that the Forest Service is in the process of working with the EPA on ensuring the continued use of fire retardants. Can you provide an update on what on that process and the importance of your work with the Forest Service to ensure this important tool can continue to be used by in the catastrophic wildfires across this country?
Yeah, there is no shortage of topics that Secretary Vilsack and I enjoy conversing on. And on this one, as an immediate solution, EPA and the Forest Service signed a federal facilities compliance agreement that allows the Forest Service to continue normal firefighting activities. What we're going to do from that point is move forward with an NPDES permit process that will, that's using our existing authorities working under the existing Clean Water Act that will give some long-term permitting assurance to the Forest Service.
Well, I hope so. To lose that that ability to use fire retardant, I wouldn't be I wouldn't be a firefighter anyway. But if I were,
Yeah.
I would think twice about going out and fighting a wildfire if they didn't have the ability to suppress these catastrophic wildfires with fire retardant
Yeah.
and stuff. So I appreciate that. Anything else? Let me just, in closing, echo what Mr. Stewart said. You're good. But I've appreciated working with you and continue and can look forward to working with you in the future on a lot of these very complex issues that the EPA deals with. So when you see the budget, don't go particularly nuts, but it won't be pretty when it first comes out, but that's the way it is.
Yes.
So anyway, look forward to working with you, and thank you for being here today.
Absolutely.
Hearing is adjourned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. You bet. Thank you. Oh, no, you do good. You do good. I suspect you were prepared for that. I always used to say,
Don't trust me, I just meant you have a lot. Being busy, thank you.
We'll see you later.
You know, that whole sewage sludge thing.
I know. Did you get your ticket situation sorted out? Yes, the only flight that is not great is the one from here in Minneapolis, which is terrible, like in terms of length. It doesn't even let you assign a seat, because it's like, I won't say overbooked, but it's full, and so they just, you get it at the gate. Flying is I'm trying right now. I hope it's very smooth for you. You know what? It's a lot. What is your, so it's DC, Minneapolis, and then is it Minneapolis to Anchorage? Yeah. How is that?
Just because I feel like.
It's okay if you don't have that.
I mean, that's like 900. Yeah, it seems like it's, I can't believe Murkowski flies there right to see waste. Yeah, she must have. I mean, this is gonna be great.
You know, sort of like, I think they,
Right, you know.
I think there's a bunch of complicated politics going on. Okay. But I might just because now that's, I just am thinking, like, on the road, what do you do? Like, yes, and soon, once everybody starts testing the farm, and I'm also wondering, like, is it different?
Well, it's 3 plus 4, it's a 7-hour flight. That's not, I mean, that's not great.
No,
I mean,
it's
for 2
okay.
days, it's like great.
But then her flight back is, she leaves at 6 a.m., flies to Seattle, and flies to JFK. Okay, all right, thank you. And make small
I know you'll be pleased to know that during the first year, changing the seats.
Oh, good, yeah.
Karen and I got it all straightened out.
There's just that one flight.
We're just following where same structure, SRFs. So I don't know. I mean, part of it was because then we were going out again. Out of the bills, so people are actually people, yeah, so that's, so now, I don't know, there's a issue with it, because I think now it's the best dress. So it'd be fun to do this, right? Wait. Oh, it's in the access. Yeah. You take the. Yeah. And it's not more, it's like basically just like my however, that is how you tell them this is going to have a budget.
So our favorite thing is first year, we're gonna be asked for 25 million in admin expenses. Second year, 50. We're having a hole to see what the third year